Hey guys, welcome to Texas Brewing. I think this is a pretty neat event, so if you guys have not used Omega, I think a lot of you guys are, according to our sales. It seems like it's just keep on growing, so you know how unique it is and some of the unique strains that they did, and we're really honored, and we have Mark here. He's a co-founder of Omega, and he's going to give us a little history lesson today, so everybody welcome Mark here.
Thanks, Wayne. No, thank you to all of you. I really appreciate the invite. It's really an honor for us to come down and get to speak to you all. And yeah, thanks for the support. And we wouldn't be here without you, so thank you. So yeah, I guess tonight we're just going to talk a little bit about our Kveik, kind of the history, a little bit of the background, how to use them. And we're also going to talk a little bit about cell counts. Are we good? All right. So maybe I'll start just briefly. I don't know if many folks know much, kind of, for those who don't know who we are, kind of our history, we can, I'll just dive into that just a little bit. So what do? We propagate yeast. We work with not only commercial breweries, but obviously home brewers. We ship all over the US at this point. We've been in business about 6 years, and we're in all 50 states, about 12 countries now. We help some commercial craft breweries with kind of, if they have any contamination issues, we can help them with different differential plating, that sort of stuff. We also heavily, our phone rings all day long with especially commercial brewers, but also home brewers if they have any questions to help, with strain selection, if they're having issues, all sorts of things like that. And then we also, for a lot of craft breweries, we privately bank. So for instance, like a side project in St. Louis, they bank a lot of their Bretts with us, so we're able to store it for them, and then we can only, unfortunately, sell it back to them and not to the public unless they're cool with that. Just a little bit of a history of the company. So my partner Lance, he's the home brewer for 20 years. He was so into brewing and yeast that he decided to get a PhD in yeast down in University of Houston. Even though he's from Illinois, Texas sucks up everyone. So he was down in Houston for quite a while to get his PhD. We founded the company in 2013. We both had day jobs. So kind of my background's engineering. I was an electrical engineer, software guy for quite a while. Lance and I both had day jobs, knew somebody else starting a brewery, and they were complaining about how all the yeast had to come from the West Coast, and Lance and I kind of like, hey, we could do this better. So we started the company at night, and kind of with the little bit of money we had, we created our own yeast prop system. So kind of how the brewing world, and you all are very, very collaborative, the yeast world is zero collaboration. So we had no idea how people propped yeast, so we kind of had to just figure it out on our own. And it's kind of cool, fast forward, we realize is we prop yeast wildly differently than a lot of our competition. And one of the biggest things that kind of separates us is we're one of the few that custom props. So we don't even, for the commercial craft world, craft brewery world, we don't even start propping their yeast till they order it. So as opposed to making large quantities of yeast and it sits in a cooler for 2 weeks, 2 months when somebody orders it, we are able to kind of reverse engineer our process so every craft beer is getting the freshest yeast possible. What does that mean to homebrewers? That means we're able to make yeast much more often in smaller batches so that we're keeping things as fresh as possible. So we run our inventory super lean, and we're able to run smaller and more frequent batches to help have you all get fresher yeast at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, we really believe fresher yeast is better. It's kind of like lettuce sitting in the cooler. The longer it's in there, you're losing cell counts, biomass. We'll talk about the cell counts in a little bit. Long and short of it, started this company. It was just Lance and I working nights. We'd go to work all day, work from like 8 p.m. to 1 in the morning, and we did that for quite a long time. So we were able to finally hire our first employee, and we've kind of grown a little bit. About 14 months ago, there were 9 of us in the company, and we just hired our 36th employee recently. So so thank you for your support. We wouldn't be here and keep growing and doing what we do if it wasn't for all of you. So let's just dive into Kveik. Did anybody have any questions thus far? Didn't think so. Good. So what is a Kveik? Everybody first, how do we pronounce this? I don't know. we had at CBC last year, we had some Norwegians stop by our booth, and we were like, how do you say it? And they all kind of did a sing-songy Kveik. But if you go and Google Kveik pronunciation, there's some MP3s. You can ask in Norwegian. Some people throw a W in there. But anyway, what does it mean? At the end of the day, it's just a dialect word for yeast. So how did we find out about a lot of these Norwegian strains to begin with? So Lars Gerasol in Oslo, if you're familiar with Lars' blog, he has spent his weekends driving out to the fjords of Norway to kind of help capture and preserve this kind of Norwegian farmhouse culture. So a lot of the kids are leaving the farmland, like I'm sure the story here and everywhere in the world, and are moving to the cities. So Lars goes out to these different fjords in the weekends to collect samples. And the first one he went to was Voss, the province of Voss, in some of those fjords. And the people there called their yeast Kveik. But when he found and went to other parts like Hornindal and Strata is our hothead, they said it had a totally different word for yeast, but kind of have broken now that everybody calls anything in Norwegian strain a Kveik at this point. So, what kind of is, so, what makes this, kind of interesting, and as a show, has anybody not used the Kveik yet? Okay. So what makes these really interesting, and it's kind of why are we talking about these right now, is they're very, very unusual strains. What they're really known for is they like to be fermented at 90 to 95. And you get no fusels, no off flavors. You use them like you would any English strain, but they have these really great taste characteristics. And again, you could throw them in your garage in the summer here and have some beautiful IPAs. What makes them super interesting as well, and why haven't we heard about them until now, is Norway never really had a commercial brewing culture. So like England, Germany, you go down to the pub or to your beer garden and you'd get your beer. Norway never had that culture. They only really drank and made beer at births, deaths, and weddings. So funerals, weddings, and births. And they usually made a really high gravity beer, generally no hops. They sometimes would throw some juniper in instead, but they really were, it seems like, doing it to get drunk. And what also makes these really cool is that they're also non-phenolic. So, like the peppery, clovey you get from a saison, none of these Kveiks have any of that. They like it hot and they are clean. That you can brew any kind of style that you're used to brewing with an English strain. So IPAs, stouts, barley wines, Imperial Stouts, anything like that. And like it says here, Norwegians regularly push up to 100 degrees. We recommend to try to stay below 95, but yeah, a lot of people even push it to 100. What is this picture kind of over here? So how did they preserve their yeast between these birth, deaths, and funerals? Is they had this Kveik ring, and it looks a lot like a human vertebrae. And it's interesting is it has a lot of surface area to volume. So what they would do is during the fermentation would dunk this ring in, and it would pick up a lot of the liquid yeast, and they'd hang it at the top of their barn, and with their climate and whatever, it would dry well enough that they could then, for future brews, could just throw the ring in, and they would be able to inoculate their batch using one of these rings. So kind of just to start with, what is a traditional Norwegian farmhouse style? A lot of it, like I mentioned, they infuse it with juniper. There's a lot of long boils, hardly any hop character at all. A lot of all three of these Norwegian strains we do sell as well. If you do ferment it at that 90-95 temperature, they'll fully ferment out in 48 hours as well. So that's what's pretty interesting. Even with high gravity beers that you do, it'll fully ferment them out in 2-3 days. So that's what the Norwegians were used to doing. They would put their fermenters in the ground as well, which is interesting, I guess, to help insulate them. For being Norway and cold, it's kind of wild that they work at these temperatures, but to have kind of an open air fermentation, fermenters in the ground, is super interesting, just with their culture. They also, not only those rings, but they have something called Kveikerstoker, which are these yeast logs, which is kind of the same thing, a log, but they would carve out the middle for a lot of surface area and throw the log in, and another way to preserve the yeast from batch to batch. And again, they dip them when it's at the top heat of when they're fermenting. And then most importantly, and maybe this is what you've all been doing wrong with your beers, is when you, in Norway, when you pitch your yeast, you need to scream into the fermenter. So if you guys have been having a lot of problem, if you've been having a lot of problem with your beer, you're clearly not screaming loud enough. So kind of where do these come from? The best thing we can find, and a lot of this comes from Richard Price out of Toronto, went through and kind of has been sequencing, and I know you can't see any of this, so I'll point out a little bit. But essentially, if we go back in time, would be the center of this ring. And as we move out, so humans essentially domesticated yeast around Europe, 500 years ago, maybe up to some, 1,000 or more. If you go back in time, from the center ring and go out, here's kind of the most ancient domesticated yeast. And as we go around the wheel, we kind of go forward in time. The kind of area back here, as you can kind of see, is more in Asia, as more of the primitive strains. So West Africa, they think a lot of them came out. And as you move up and more modern ones, you have here Belgium, Germany, the United States, UK, kind of our more strains you're used to using, or more down in this region. So where do the Norwegians fit in, the Kveiks? Well, the red strain. So if you notice, there's a bunch here, and if you I know you can't see it, but Hornindal and I believe Voss is here. You have a bunch here, kind of in that Germany, UK area, and then up here, in the more ancient side, you have another batch of gene markers. So the best we can come up with, and again with Richard Price out of Toronto, is that somehow some ancient kind of more wild strains came from Asia, and some maybe British strains. And again, I don't know why it comes back to the Vikings. This is all, again, conjecture. But maybe the Vikings, in raiding England heavily, brought some of those English strains back to Norway, which just happened to mate and hybridize with some wild strains from Asia. So you ended up with some of these children that had really unique properties, where they are non-phenolic like the English, and they have great taste, but they can ferment at high temperatures, high alcohol content, tolerance, and that sort of thing. So it's just kind of interesting how these came about. But that's the best we can come up with. Another chart you probably can't see. The left half says temperature. That's anything from about 86 up to about 100, 105. The other side here is ethanol content, 10, 12, 14, 16%. The top four lines are essentially Chico and strains you're used to using. And what's important on this chart is essentially anything that's bold is showing that it works really well at that temperature or that alcohol content. So if you kind of notice at these high temps, none of your Chicos and your normal strains are working well. At 10 to 16%, they're also not working very well. When you get into some of these Norwegian strains, which essentially is here down, you can see in various temperatures and ethanol that they're running, they run and do really well. So for instance, Hornindal here is doing really well at 100, even up to 100, I guess that'd be like about 102. And alcohol tolerance, you can see it's even doing really well at 16%. So we'll get into that in a little bit, but we have a recipe in a little bit. With the Hornindal especially, can do some super high alcohol tolerance. So we've done a 16% barley wine that was super drinkable, no off flavors or fusels or any kind of any tasting. It was dangerously drinkable. So what kind of esters profile do a lot of these also have? And again, for these first three columns, you can see it's a lot of pineapple, tropical fruitiness, some cognac, apple, especially with Hornindal, as you notice, it's popping up with a lot more tropical fruit esters, which we'll talk about in a little bit too. So yeah, out of the three Kveiks we offer, Hothead is probably the cleanest. It's a lot of brewers are using it for an APA. You can use it in a Berliner Weisse, which we do in a little bit in a recipe. It's kind of interesting one. It doesn't seem to matter what temperature you ferment this at. It has a very similar ester production. So we did a experiment where we fermented, I believe, at 90 and 70, and you barely could tell the difference in tasting the two with ester production. And that one especially too, we've even fluctuated. So if it gets warm during the day in your garage and gets cool at night, it doesn't seem to care. It still produces a really awesome beer. The Voss Kveik is a bit more citrusy, fruity. A lot of people have been using that as a Chico replacement. If you're a big Chico fan, I highly recommend trying that with some of your beers. There's an awesome brewery in Springfield, Illinois that has recently did a Voss wit with the Voss, and it was not like anything I've ever had. It was really unusual. So that Voss, I think at the lab, our production folks up in Chicago, we bought a 1-barrel system. We had no idea who's going to be drinking 31 gallons a week, but somehow it's gone every week. But we're pushing, about half of our crew in Chicago were former commercial brewers, so we're constantly pushing them to be going crazy and pushing the limit. So they've been always going back and forth, but they were really big into Hornindal for a while. Now they're swinging back to Voss. So Voss is super versatile, does some really cool stuff. And then Hornindal here, especially, I think is one of our favorite. It's that, especially again at 90, 95 is some really more pronounced ester production. And for Hornindal, it's a little bit more tropical fruity. Some people get stone fruit out of it, like in an Imperial Stout. It comes out kind of stone fruity, and that one's also really awesome. It complements modern hops really well and your kind of boring old sea hops. So if you're looking to kind of switch it up a little bit, Hornindal's great. And that Hornindal is especially good at higher alcohol tolerance as well. Guy mentioned and we'll talk about. So kind of just circling back, a little bit about Kveik. So will Kveiks affect my equipment? No, I mean it is just 100% sack. It's not like any other English strain. You use it just like you would. It's not diastaticus. It's not Brett. It's not anything that you're not used to using. How do I make a Kveik beer? Again, like we mentioned, Kveik just means yeast. So how do I make a yeast beer? I think it's more thinking of Kveik as a different kind of just tool that you would use to make any beer that you're planning to use anyway. What kind of styles? Like we were talking a little bit. Anything you'd use in English ale. So IPAs, hazies, APAs, porters, stouts, barley wine, imperial stouts. You go to town. And we've talked about how do you pronounce Kveik. Everybody has their opinion. So how are people using these Kveiks in more modern brewery? And a lot of people have been using them, you know, commercial brewers and home brewers for, like we've talked about, a lot of high alcohol tolerance, anything where you're looking for clean, non-phenolic beer. What's cool in the you know, in homebrew too, if you've got a party coming up in 7 days, I guess you could knock out a beer from grain to glass pretty quick. But for commercial breweries, they love it because, especially like when they get just slammed in the summer when everybody's drinking like crazy, a lot of commercial brewers have been using our Kveiks in order to get, you know, they're able to turn beer out a little quicker, really help their bottom line, buy more equipment, whatever they got to do. It's been really great.
So that's a good question because I've had that from commercial brewers.
Yeah.
They're like, well, how do we get it hot?
So
because most of the time, you know, they're on a glycol chiller, right?
Yeah. So most people, you can knock these out at 90 and pitch at 90. And then we suggest setting your glycol chiller to 95 in a commercial brewery setting. You don't have to, a lot of people think you've got to knock out around 70 something and then raise your temperature and then pitch. No, they like to be pitched right at 90. So you could knock out at 90 and then just set your glycol to 95. We've had some brewers who had their, like commercial brewers, had their fermenters in the tap room in the summer, and the ambient temperature got up to about 86. And they forgot to turn their glycol chiller on, and they came back the next morning because these strains create their own heat, and especially like a Hornindal will just create a ton of heat. Came back and it was at 106, and now we're getting a little too hot, or it'll start to stall. So we definitely hit your glycol chillers around 95, save a little bit on energy costs, but.
I saw somewhere on Milk the Funk that they had people were turning like blondes in 3 days.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, it's pretty awesome. If you can ferment about that 95, you can really fully ferment out generally, and even some higher gravity beers in 2 to 3 days. We actually, one of our recipes, if you're in a pinch and need to turn something around quickly, it's a really great way to do that. And one of our recipes actually is a 5-day Berliner Weisse, which we can talk about in a little bit. So actually we just mentioned lower energy cost, and then once you kind of start playing around with them, they do have some unique ester profile, especially if you're fermenting hot. The esters are a little more pronounced, which is great. Does anybody have any questions up to this point?
All right. In Norway, how did you determine that 95 in the high 90s is good for these beers? I mean, it doesn't get that hot in Norway, so.
I know. I honestly don't know.
Was it ever hit 95 in Norway?
I mean, I guess pitching temps.
I was gonna say pitching temps, and then they're putting their fermenters in the ground. I mean, the ground's a phenomenal insulator. So I guess if you're knocking out at 95, pouring into the a fermenter in the ground,
I noticed on one of those screens it said cream ale.
Yeah.
Which one of the yeast works best for making a cream ale?
I would say the Hornindal is the cleanest. If you're looking for more of a traditional cream ale,
Okay.
the hothead is super clean. If you're not looking for like fruity esters or citrusy, so yeah, I would use the hothead because it's the cleanest for a cream.
Okay.
Yeah.
Making into this with the 5-day Berliner Weisse, how does pH affect performance?
We haven't found pH to affect any of the Norwegians, just like the English strains for the most part, like our British one or some of those with Goza or any of that, they seem to do fine after like a kettle sour, for instance. Yeah, they seem to work fine for whatever reason. Yeah.
Generations, like batch to batch to batch.
Yeah.
Do you notice any difference?
We don't notice any difference so the question, sorry if everybody hasn't been hearing all the questions. The last question before was, do these work well in a low pH if you're looking to kettle sour with a lacto, and they seem to work really well with souring after kettle souring in an acidic environment. The next question was, how well do they repitch? And they repitch just as well as any of the others. So most commercial brewers are getting 8, 10 generations out of it, and don't seem to have any issues. They work like any other strain. Yeah. Anybody else have anything? One thing we have noticed, however, these do seem, especially the Hornindal, but all of them seem to be needing a lot of nutrients. So we found that especially the Hornindal works much better at a high gravity than a low gravity. So at a low gravity, it actually can struggle, which is interesting. So we really recommend a broad-based kind of nutrient, like Fermate or something like that, sort of Weisses. The best we can come up with is just that there's so much grain at a high gravity, they're getting enough trace minerals to do what they need to do, but at a low gravity, they might not be getting all those trace minerals. So anybody who's ever had any issues with these, which is rare, it seems to be nutrient driven. So we definitely recommend, if you're especially not doing a high gravity beer, to use a broad-based nutrient. So speaking of the Berliner Weisse, so this was one of our recipes, and we can share these with you afterward if anyone's interested. So this was what we called our actually 5-day Berliner Weisse. We started at 10:39, ended up at 10:10. Nothing crazy, 3.8 with that grain bill. You could see 40% Pilsner, 50% white wheat, and 10% Munich. And this one we actually didn't use any hops at all. And so we started with our lacto. I don't know if anybody's used our lacto blend 605. It's a mix of Plantarum and Brevis. It's a little different than a lot of the other lactos on the market. And this one especially is great, it's really, really great for kettle souring. So if you're looking for a really clean sour that you can dial in, like in this recipe, we mashed it at 148, and we pitched our lacto, is the 605 here, at about 90 degrees, and we insulated the carboy just to make sure to keep it warm enough. In about 24 hours, that'll get you down to about 3.2, 3.4 pH. And you can dial that sourness in wherever you want. From there, you can either boil off that bacteria to kill it, chill again, and then pitch your yeast, like we did here with our hothead, the 057. This lacto also is very hop sensitive, so we've had other people, commercial brewers even too, if you're okay having lacto in your beer and you want those probiotics, you can just, when you dry hop, it'll stall all that lacto out entirely. So even 1 IBU will stall this lacto. It's very, very hop sensitive, by the way. So essentially, if you, with unhopped wort at about 90-95, in about 18 to 24 hours, you'll be down to that 3.2, 3.4, which is around where we were in 24 hours. That's when we pitch the hothead, and again, trying to keep that, maintain that heat. So we really recommend with these Norwegians, a lot of people, especially in the winter, sometimes in the summer, but you really want to insulate your carboys. So you want to wrap it with sleeping bags, or if you've got, special insulators, you can buy insulators for your carboy and all that, I believe. But you really want to keep them warm, because they will create their own heat, but, you want to make sure they're staying above 90, all these Norwegians. So for this one, within, 4 days there, no, I'm sorry, just 3 days-ish, we were down to terminal gravity. And then on day 4, cold crashed it and transferred the keg, forced carbonate. So about 5 days after, we were fully ready to drink. Yeah,
What
go
are
ahead.
your typical fermentations of course, the krausen that's formed? Do you typically always have to use blow-off tubes?
Yes, it's kind of interesting. Some people, it ends up going so fast, some people don't seem to have much krausen at all. And they're like, the yeast isn't working. We're always like, just check your gravity, and it's already done. Some other people seem to have crazy blow-off and need a ton of head. So that's one thing we've been experimenting with to try to figure out why that seems to happen. But yeah, I'd recommend having the blow-off tube just in case. But as a whole, you don't seem to need crazy amount of headspace for any of these. Anybody else have any questions? So here's another one we did as a Imperial Stout. And a lot of these are on our website too, if anybody's looking for them, but like I said, can spread these around. This one we started at 11.14, ended down at 10.40 with about almost 10% ABV. You can see our grain bill there. And for this one, we just did the kind of normal mashed in and boiled for a while. Knocked in at 90, and because this was such a big beer, we pitched with two packs of our Hornindal. You're more than welcome to make a starter. I can tell you about our other product another time if anybody's interested. We created a proper starter if anybody has tried that, but basically pasteurized wort. It's in the back there. And the orange cans, but pasteurized wort, so you can essentially make a starter in about 3 minutes. You can just kind of sanitize the top, pop it, pour it, the can into a flask that's been also sanitized, and basically put your yeast, pour foil over it, and you're good to go. Thank you. So if anybody has any questions about this, feel free. But yeah, that's another way if anybody is hating starters, you're obviously always welcome to pitch 2 packs, but another way, potentially more cost effective, or depending on how much time you have, you can use that.
I think that might be something, I don't know if you're gonna hit on that, is the actual cell counts in your packages versus like competition?
Yeah, we'll talk about that at the end. We're gonna talk a little about cell counts, just a little science experiment, thought experiment for everybody at the end we can get into. But going back to the Imperial Stout, so again, because this was such a big beer, we did 2 packs. And it does like it hot, it likes high gravity beers, but we still wanted to make sure we had enough biomass there. Fermented it at 90, and so for this one it only took 4 days to fully churn from, 11.14 down to 10.40 in about 4 days.
Is 1040 where it stops at then, or?
Yeah, that's where it ended up. So, I think the apparent attenuation for most of these are around 75 to 80%. So for this one, it was it says dangerously drinkable. There's no fusels. This one ended up with a little bit, like I mentioned, the stone fruit esters. Very smooth, dark chocolatey. Almost every Imperial Stout I've had with Hornindal has turned out fantastic.
So like malted trios, does it ferment that, or is it,
For which?
like long chain sugars, is it like
No, so like a diastaticus would?
Yeah.
No, so they're not diastaticus. That's a good sidebar. Does anybody not know what a diastaticus is, or does anybody? Let's talk about diastaticus. So, what is a diastaticus? I'm sure people have heard the term thrown out a lot. A lot of craft brewers can freak out. One of our competitors is in a lawsuit over it. Essentially what it is most ales that you're used to using, like English style ales, all that, your normal ales can eat more, let's just say, simple sugars, and they're not able to eat complex sugars. So they'll eat all the simple sugars, you're left with some of that residual sweetness. With complex sugars, longer chain sugars, and then kind of end of story. What does a diastaticus do? And a diastaticus generally are like your saisons and your Belgian kind of world in general, or Joveru if anybody's played with that. A diastaticus yeast cell, which is also an ale, but it can essentially secrete an enzyme, and that enzyme can eat your complex sugars and break those. I shouldn't say eat, I should say break. They're able to break those long complex sugars into simple sugars, and then can eat those simple sugars. So for instance, it's almost interesting under a microscope. If you just put one diastaticus cell in, you can see kind of a halo of where these enzymes are being secreted, breaking the complex sugars into simple, and then the yeast cell itself can eat all those simple. So if anybody's heard of a brute IPA, that's an artificial way essentially to diastaticus your beer, where essentially when you pitch your yeast, your ale yeast, so let's just say you're pitching a normal English strain, you would also pitch an enzyme, glucoamylase, and that enzyme is breaking all the complex sugars into simple, and then that English ale strain is eating everything and driving your beer down to 1 to 100% attenuation. So that's a brute, as in a champagne brute, B-R-U-T. You end up with a very effervescent, light beer because all the sugar's been eaten and it's crazy dry. So a diastaticus essentially can kind of do the same thing naturally by secreting the enzyme when it's eating it. But you end up generally, like say the French saison, you'll end up at like a 90% attenuation, apparent attenuation, if that makes sense. Cool.
I take it later we're going to talk about that new strain for the brutes.
We might. Oh no, I hit end. Give me 2 seconds. Alright, so the end of the stout. The next one, real quick, one more recipe. We did a 16% barley wine. It was crazy drinkable. 1150, ended up down at 1030, 16%. Hopped it a little bit with Columbus. So the one thing with this, we did start, I believe, with like 15 gallons and did some crazy long boils, as you noticed, just to help really concentrate it. But we didn't have to ever feed it any wort. It just was growing on its own. Again, since it was such a huge beer, we started with 2 packs of Hornindal. You could also do a starter, and knocked out at 95 to ferment around 90 to 95. And this one only took 36 hours to get to a 16% barley wine, which is mind-boggling. Again, we conditioned it for a little bit, for 72, just to remove the, been drinking all day, I'm sorry. We touched down at like 8 a.m. and we hit brain dead at 9, and it's been a long day. It was very drinkable. It's an excellent drink if anybody's ever looking for it. No fusels, none of that boozy burn. It was dangerously drinkable. It's very smooth. It was one of my favorites that's been made out of the Hornindal. Does anybody have any questions on any of these recipes?
Well, I guess what was the primary reason why that one went to 16% where the IPA or the stout only went to like about 10%?
I honestly don't know. I can find out for you. It's a really good question. It's something I should know, but I don't. I'm not gonna bullshit you, so. Our crew would know, but yeah, that one I've been thinking, I don't know.
I have a stout stuff at 1.040 and I was like, one even lower.
I'll come after the talk. Come up. We'll figure it out. Anybody else have any questions?
Barley wine, did you have to age it or did you drink it right away?
We drank it right away. Let it condition for whatever that 72 hours, but yeah, you were able to drink it right away. It didn't really take too much aging. So I guess you could age it, but yeah, it was still
Is that
drinkable.
is that a lot of the reason, I mean, for the most part, that's the reason you age beers is kind of to reduce the fusel alcohols, right?
Yeah, exactly. But since these don't produce any fusels to begin with, you don't have anything to age. You don't have any issues. Anybody else? Cool. So, I'll talk a little bit about some of our future projects. Maybe I can try to pull up some pictures. So, I guess going with, so Norway, we found a lot of these strains. We're, hopefully keep finding more that way. I don't know if anybody's familiar with our Jovaru or Jovaru, I'm sure as people pronounce it in Lithuania, but our Jovaru Lithuanian farmhouse is a really cool strain. Kind of interesting story. I don't know if anybody has used that one yet. It's kind of in the Belgian world. Great. So, kind of the story on that one. We, essentially there's a 72-year-old brewer in rural Lithuania. She's been brewing for like 50 years, studied under her father, and her great-great-grandfather found a strain in the woods of rural Lithuania in the 1850s on a tree. I mean, where else are you going to find yeast? And kind of fast forward is they've been now traditionally brewing. They do kind of an open air fermentation. They do a no boil raw raw mash, and she actually creates a tea hop. Uses the hops and creates a tea and ends up blending that in with her beer. And they don't really collaborate because down the street or down the road, apparently another brewery, they bake their mash in the oven before they go through. So everybody in Lithuania is doing interesting things. I guess during the USSR, you could only buy certain 3 or 4 macros, and they were still illegally in the backwoods of Lithuania, still brewing their traditional brews. So, kind of how do we come across this is I guess we're getting known so well for kind of bringing strains from around the world. The Lithuanian consulate in Philadelphia contacted us, and I swear to God we were being catfished. Because the whole thing didn't make any sense, and I was like, what the hell's going on? Well, it ended up being legit, and they flew, as we started getting into kind of negotiating, they flew the beer from Lithuania to Philadelphia. And then Pennsylvania has such draconian laws with alcohol, you're not able to ship alcohol. Like, she couldn't mail it to us in Chicago. So she personally flew it to D.C., to the embassy, and another consulate flew it from D.C. to the consulate in Chicago. And I actually put a suit on, which sucks, and I had to go downtown because the Eastern Europeans are very formal people, and that's cool. So, and I never, 5 years ago, would have never expected I was going to be in the Lithuanian consulate in downtown Chicago. It was super weird. So I had a suit on, went downtown to their consulate office overlooking the Chicago River in the dead of winter, and found myself sitting on a couch with the consulate general, drinking the strongest coffee of my life, talking about American craft beer, while we ate a Lithuanian tree cake. And he was like, it takes 63 eggs to make one cake. And I was like, what? They have kind of a spit. They have a spit where they essentially make this egg batter and pour it over the spit as it turns, and the drips of the egg batter create tree branches. And then you break these branches off, dip it in your coffee. It was really good. I highly recommend one if you could find one. Regardless, long and short of it, we were able to hack out a really great contract, exclusive contract, that we would be the ones bringing this strain to the U.S. And Aldonia, the brewer, her name's Aldonia in Lithuania, then gets some of the proceeds. So every time you guys buy it, you're helping her as well, and so we can, profit share with her. Her kids apparently don't want to continue the tradition, purportedly, and so this is a way to help her, as she does what she does. So definitely try it out. It's in the Belgian world, so it is a diastatic, diastaticus, but it's a bit more mild on the peppery clovey. If you're looking kind of as an entry gateway, Belgian, I wouldn't even call it maybe a saison, but in the Belgian world, has kind of a lemon pith, peppery. It's a really, really coul strain. We brewed a wit with it, and it turned out really well. So that's one thing definitely check out. If anybody else isn't familiar, we're also creating our own strains in the lab. So I don't know if anybody's familiar with our Saisonstein, for instance. We really like the taste of the DuPont Saison, for you Saison lovers, but it's a real bitch to ever ferment with. If you go up or down a degree, it stalls for weeks. So Lance, my partner, the PhD geek, he was able to get into the lab, and he was able to get the French Saison and the DuPont Saison to mate with some low lighting, some berry white. It's proprietary. And we ended up with 220 genetically unique children. So each child had random genetic material from each parent. So not blends, but just like you and your siblings, got random genes from your parents. And we did gallon batches of all of those children until we found one, our Saisonstein, that it tastes very similar to the DuPont, but it's a beast and will ferment a shoe like the French Saison. So that's one I really, if you're looking to do a Saison, that's a really great one to play with.
And only you guys, last year, I won the Stein for Saison, was with that strain, so just FYI.
Here you are. Tooting his own horn, I love it. So just recently, a couple weeks ago, we just released our second hybrid called Gullo, which is Latin for glutton. And essentially, we were able to mate the French Saison and the Irish Ale, the Guinness strain, and some of the children, lo and behold, are non-phenolic, but have that attenuation of the French. So it's a diaceticus, it secretes an enzyme that can break those, long chains to short. You can get down to about a 90% apparent attenuation, so pretty dry, but you still have some of that residual sweetness a little bit, but all non-phenolic. So you don't have any of that peppery, clovey, taste. And what's kind of cool is you can actually fully taste those fruity esters from the French Saison that's normally either complemented with the peppery or kind of masked by the peppery clovey. All that kind of shines. So that's a really great strain if anybody's looking to play around with something to get a drier ale, but to have it non-phenolic and not have to use any enzymes. So that's one of our newer strains we just came out with recently.
And if you guys hit the kegerator, there is a brut IPA that's made with that strain, so.
Awesome. Congrats. I'll have to check that one out.
Yeah, I can say I brewed that one, and I brewed it here, so it didn't ferment as warm as I would have liked it, and I got down to a 1008.
Wow.
Just
Well done.
naturally.
We tested it before we kegged, and it was at 1.
Well, that's I added the enzyme to get it down to that, but it was a 1008 naturally. Like I said, I didn't ferment. It fermented at like 68, 70.
Okay.
If I did it at home, I would have bumped it up.
Yeah, I was gonna say if you bumped up, it might have got down to maybe like 1004 or something, but yeah.
And that's what I was hoping. I was hoping for a 1002,
Yeah.
4-ish. So.
So yeah, as a disclaimer, if you do want to drive it to 1, you do need to add a little enzyme. But if you're looking for pretty dry, but not 100% that effervescent, it's a really great strain to play with. So, some of our kind of other future projects and things we're looking at is we recently were able to hire a full-time research and development person who has a PhD in yeast, and she also was like I think she was the head brewer at Great Central it's a contract brewer up in Chicago. So it's been really cool to have somebody who has been contract, commercial brewing, but also has that kind of PhD, deep knowledge of yeast. And she was getting out of her way and let her go to town, and she's coming up with all kinds of stuff. A lot of projects we've had on the back burner that Lance and we've been too busy to work on, she's able to kind of run with now. So one thing we've been looking into is generational behavior. For all you scientists, or if you're familiar with epigenetics, so I'm sure you're familiar with mutations in DNA, like in the movies. Your DNA changes, crazy shit happens, aliens, zombies, whatever. Epigenetics is a little different, is the DNA doesn't really change, it's more environmental factors can turn genes on and off. So for instance, the really cool example, or disturbing example for humans, is if your grandparents go through a starvation period, the grandchildren have a much, much higher risk of getting diabetes. So just weird shit like that. The environmental factor of not having enough food can skip a generation and affect the grandchildren. So we're finding out in yeast, depending how you prop your yeast can have a lot of ramifications, multi-generations down the line. So we're constantly experimenting, and our crew in Chicago knows every strain we prop so well that we actually prop every strain a bit differently because they're getting to know they're all such different beasts. Just like, we've domesticated yeast no different than cattle or cows. We've domesticated some for dairy, some for meat. It's interesting, we treat them differently. So it's the same we're learning with yeast and making sure our propping isn't having any effects down the road, but actually making your effects down in multi-generations down the road, making it better. So it's one thing we've been playing around with, and trying to be well known for just having better propping techniques. We've been screwing around with pitching rates, such as Norwegian, some people under, some people over. So far, it's all been kind of anecdotal for severe underpitching or any underpitching. We haven't really seen much difference, honestly, yet, but we'll keep playing around with that. Hazies, if anybody's into Northeast and all the hazies out there, the jury's still kind of scientifically out of why it's hazy. There's some sort of protein suspended in the solution there, but they don't really, nobody fully understands quite why. So it seems to be certain yeast strains, like our British 5, Hornindal does well at hazy, our Conan or Dippa strain does really well at hazy, tropical IPA. Everybody seems to have a certain percentage of oats, and then certain types of hops all seem to make, you know, a really great hazy, but nobody fully understands the science of why that's happening. So that's some of the experiments we've been running, just to, you know, shits and giggles, trying to do a brut with a stout, using that gulo, or, you know, trying to do a brut IPA but use a stout, kind of a dry stout, be interesting. Not many people have screwed around with Kveiks and Bretts, so that's one thing we kind of been playing around with. More and more meaderies have been reaching out and playing around with the Norwegians. So the Hornindal, especially for if you're looking for high alcohol, for honey seems to work pretty well. Somebody recently did a Indian Summer Tart Cherry mead. And it turned out, you know, not as dry, I think, as they would have liked, but yeah, it's just, we kind of just keep pushing the boundaries. It's also new, kind of just seeing what's going on out there.
Which one did you say was good for honey?
Hornindal. Some people have, you know, rum distilleries have been trying to screw around with it, meads for, you know, say honey and that more higher sugar content ones like that.
I had a customer today that was asking if any of y'all strains would be good for his mead.
Yeah, so and
Sure, so.
it's one of those, I've only heard some examples, I don't have any scientific data to back it up, but there are some people with honey at least have been seemingly enjoying the Hornindal for that, so. Does anybody have any questions up to this point before we talk about cell counts?
Have you just mentioned that you've had a rum distillery talking about using the Hornindal. Have you had any luck working with distillers for any particular distiller's yeast strains?
Not so much. I mean, as a whole, my take on distillers is they're trying to get the most alcohol out of a pound of grain they can, and don't seem to care about ester profiles and all that. And I don't know if that's whether when it goes in a barrel, a lot of that gets kind of filtered out, or what. But for now, it seems that almost every distiller we've ever talked to just balks at paying liquid yeast prices, and they seem to just care about getting a dry strain that gets you the most alcohol for the most, you know, out of that pound of grain, that whatever they're using grain-wise, so sugar, grain, whatever. So that's been my experience so far. I don't know if do you have any, do you distill?
No, but
No.
we get questions from people interested
In distilling.
on basis.
Which is illegal, don't distill at home.
Yes.
Yes, I think people, so yes, we only get questions generally from the commercial side of things. If one were to want to do it at home, which I'm not suggesting you should do because it's illegal, Hornindal would probably be the way to go. If you're not caring about how much alcohol you're producing. So at a home level, yeah, go for it. See what happens. But not.
If you're using Kveik for wine or cider, something that's more simple sugars, would you recommend doing anything different from just throwing it in there and letting it go?
I'm trying to remember if somebody's done it with, I've never heard anybody using it for wine, and I don't know how well it would do with wine, just because it's such a different world of your, you know, what you're using. Cider, I think one or two people have tried to use the Hornindal with cider, and I think did pretty well, but don't quote me. I don't know many people have tried it, honestly. But cider, I think you'd be better off trying. I'm trying to think if I've heard of anyone else. No. Yeah, it can't hurt to try, but no, not many people have tried it at the end of the day. So we don't have much evidence. Anybody else? All right, cool. So cell counts. How many people use these cell count calculators online to figure out how big of a starter to do? 1, 2, 3. Okay. For those who've never used one, essentially the conventional wisdom is you should be pitching around 3/4 to 1.5 million cells per mil per degree Plato. And what these calculators essentially do is you can put in your pitch rate and batch size and a bunch of data, and it spits out, you need this many yeast cells, and you need to do, this size of a volume of starter. So, we kind of, in our just been propping for a while, and what said, well, this doesn't make much sense from our kind of experience. So, to make it more scientific, we did an experiment. And essentially, we went through and all 80-something strains, or actually now we're probably at 100 when we add in all our breads, strains, we basically took 100 mil of 1040 wort, and 1040 is what we use to prop, and we put them in a small flask, and then we inoculated just a little bit of cells for each one of all of our whole strain collection. We let them grow until we got the maximum cell density, and then we counted cells for each one of those, 80-something strains. And we did that for everything. And so what did we get? For those in the back who maybe can't see it, for Hefeweizen, we got about 100 million cells per mil. For our West Coast ale, the Chico, we got 150 million per mil. French Saison, 465 million cells per mil. And Brett L, we got 885 million cells per mil. So the cell counts are all over the place, from 100 million cells all the way up to 885 million cells. So what the hell's going on? Here's another view, just visually, of what you end up with for Hefeweizen, the Chico. This is the Brett L, and our Saison, French Saison. And as you kind of notice, it's not differing too much, but your cake is pretty much the same across the board. So what does all this kind of mean? The best way we could kind of come up with it is more of maybe a metaphor. And if you think of each yeast cell as a factory, and its job is to make more factories, you essentially can think, of the cells that way, and that wort components, meaning your sugars, you can see as raw material, and the factories will keep making copies of themselves until they run out of raw materials. And the emissions, the waste products, are your alcohol, carbon dioxide, your esters. So how did we end up with so many different cell counts? Well, kind of as you really get into it and kind of look under the microscope and start looking at stuff, is some factories are bigger than other factories. So for instance, bigger factories, they need more raw, let's say the Hefeweizen or the Chico might need 10 raw units to copy itself, while the Saison might only need 3 units to copy itself. So, of course, in that scenario, as you can see, this would be the Saison, for instance, is it only needs 3 units of sugar, of raw units, to copy itself, and it ends up with, let's say, 8 cells at the end of the day, because it's kept, replicating itself, plus the 2 that are already there. So you end up with a chunk more of that. But if we look at, say, the Chico might need 10 units to replicate. So since they are so much bigger, physically bigger, they need more resources to replicate. So even with the same amount of wort, same raw material, you might only end up with, say, 4. I'm just making up numbers here. It would really be 5 and 10 for you really keeping track. And then the Hefeweizen, for instance, might be the same size as Chico, but Hefeweizen's really bad at replicating itself. So it struggles to make more cells of itself. But the good part of that is it's able to make more beer, because it's not making more copies of itself. Instead, it's taking the sugar and it's creating it into beer. So kind of what does all this mean? The long and short of it, the bigger the cell, you're going to have less cells. And the smaller the cell, you're going to have more cells. So at the end of the day, because they all started with the same raw material, you end up with the same biomass. And what do I mean by biomass? This is kind of a visual for it. Is the cake is very kind of, more similar. If we were to take every one of these and put it on a filter and dry it out, and when the water's all been dried out and evaporated, we could weigh all 4 of these, and they'd weigh the exact same amount. Because they started with the same raw materials, and it's kind of agnostic. It doesn't matter how big the cell is, because the bigger the cell, you're going to have fewer of them. The smaller the cell, you're going to have more of them. At the end of the day, though, if you weigh that biomass that's left over, it's all the same. So kind of what does this mean is we honestly don't think cell count is a very good unit of measurement for yeast. Biomass is a much better cell count, or much better measurement count. So if you kind of notice on our packs, we go out of our way to not put cell count because it's not true, it's not genuine. Because we'd have to put for our Saison, we'd have to be putting much, much higher numbers than we would for our Hefeweizen, than we would our Chico. So when you see 100 million, 150 million, 150 or 200 billion, we find that to be a little disingenuous because it depends on the strain, and it's not really a good marker. If we really all wanted to be really more true to science, we should be putting a unit of biomass on all of our packs, all competitors, for you to do a more apples to apples comparison if that's what you're looking to do. We think we prop a little differently and our yeast works better, and we see it, I guess, as more as there's an optimal biomass for a certain amount of wort. So, for instance, our packs are meant to be used for 5 gallons at 1060 or less. You should be, able to direct pitch one of our packs because we're giving you the optimal amount of biomass for that strain, and we could get into the cell count. When people, even online, like, hey, how many cell counts is in this pack? We say, well, what strain is it? And then we can give them an accurate number if they really want that. But at the end of the day, we're giving you the perfect, what we think is the optimal biomass for that strain for 1060 or less for a 5-gallon pitch. So, our shelf life is five months. We highly recommend in that last month or two to do a starter just to make sure. It's really hard to overpitch in a homebrew size setting. But anyway, going back to the calculator, what does kind of all that mean is essentially if we really wanted a true calculator online, it would have to be strain specific. You'd have to have an input that says, well, what strain are you using in order to get the correct cell counts? But, anyone who's used a cell count calculator, it works. So it's one of those things it's kind of unnecessary. If you think of it as a biomass calculator, you end up getting the same result. So at the end of the day, it's kind of a conceptual thing. So at the end of your calculator's lying to you, but it's okay. Because if you think about it as a biomass calculator, you come out with the same results. But just conceptually to know what's really going on kind of behind the scenes, and when you're doing things, the cell count isn't everything. Really what we found is biomass is a much better indicator.
One of the things that we did I thought was interesting, so we did a little experiment of our own, and we had a local brewery. They actually, we got 10 or 15 packs of just Chico ale yeast. And we took, every month we would take, and this is just, it's just no scientific whatever, right? But I thought it was interesting is that the pack started out with a lot more cell counts than what the calculator said it should have.
Yeah.
And as it got older, it was way higher cell count than what it actually said on the calculator.
Interesting.
So, it was kind of interesting experiment. I know it's just a one-time shot thing, but we just kept it in the refrigerator, and it actually had a lot higher cell count than what the calculators were saying.
Interesting. Cool.
So my question is, with your yeast strains, we can safely, under 1.060, pitch just one package of yeast and feel comfortable that it's going to ferment out properly.
Yes. If it's within 3 months of packaging, if it's in month 4 or 5, we would recommend a starting.
Okay.
But yes, if you let it warm up a little bit and let it, get kind of acclimated to the room temperature for, however long and direct pitch, you should be fine as long as you're not, there's certain instances like cold pitching lager, I don't know if you've seen those experiments, but people who pitch lagers at 65 and at 50 degrees, they kept at those temperatures the entire time, and they had a panel of 20 pro tasters. And out of that 20 pro-tasting panel, they could not statistically tell the difference between the two beers. So, what does that mean? Lagers, just because they work at 50 doesn't mean that's the only temperature you can use them at. We tell all the commercial brewers, you really should pitch at 65 for at least 24 hours and then move it down if you really want to 50. But if you really want to cold pitch at 50, you need to be starting with much more cells. So for that instance, you know, we would recommend do a starter out of the gate if you're looking to cold pitch a lager at 50. But if you're going to pitch a lager at 65, you should be fine with direct pitching our pack, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So in general, for most cases, yes, you're fine direct pitching if it's been packaged within 3 months. For 1060 or less for 5 gallons.
Even with your loggers, you said. Even with
If
your
you're
logger trains.
not cold pitching the lager.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're cold pitching, I mean, yeast really just doesn't like to be cold. So if you're cold pitching at 50, you're going to need a lot more cells to get that oomph going. But if you start at 65, and even if you let it go 24 hours, it'll make enough cells that we can replicate enough. You can then bring it down to 50 if you want. Yeah, so even just 24 hours at 65 makes a huge difference than if you're trying to just slog it out at 50. Anybody else? More questions? A couple acknowledgements here. You can look at our jazzy mural at our lab. I know you guys have questions. Come on. I meant y'all got questions. Sorry, I went to college in New Orleans. I was deep in the y'all world, and then I went back north. I'm sorry.
Just kind of what you're talking about, the yeast calculator. I brewed yesterday. Yeah, I bought your yeast here, which all of our yeast, when it comes from you, I mean, we got it in today and it was 3 days old. It is super fresh when we get it. So,
Awesome.
I mean, this yeast was 2 weeks old. My starting gravity was at 1062 and it told me I needed a 2-liter starter. I did by the math, but I knew that was bullshit because I've used y'all's yeast. And I knew I built a 1-liter starter with your proper start, and I mean, it's going gangbusters 24 hours later. Like that's
Good to hear.
So I didn't realize that it was, so your cell count varies by the yeast strain, not 100 billion or, you know, per.
Right.
Okay. That's interesting. That's
Right,
like
so
all
I guess
cell.
we're saying the reason the calculators still work generally, and that, yeah, seems a bit overkill, but generally work is it's more of conceptually a biomass is what they're, that's, you know, honestly, some of the more, you know, cool, higher end, you know, famous brewers and from repitching aren't even really doing cell counts. They're weighing their yeast because they know that strain, they know what they're doing. They've done enough, they'll weigh their yeast and they use that to repitch. So, I mean, and that's honestly how we do a lot of our propping on our end is through weight and biomass, because we're finding that's a much better variable indicator, you know, than cell count. I mean, you don't have to be so strain specific and anyway. So yeah, biomass is the end of the day, that's the key. So when you're really making a starter, you're really trying to increase the biomass of that yeast so that you're getting a good optimal, you know, biomass of yeast to wort ratio at the end of the day. So if you have too little biomass for the amount of work you're doing, you're going to underpitch, which, you know, for homebrew is the bigger risk versus overpitching. So my partner's so old school, he always recommends doing a starter no matter what. That's just what he's always done. Part of that, I think, is just, you know, before we got in the game and some others that allow you to direct pitch, that's just what you do. We're doing some experiments to show there are some, you know, more qualitative things that a starter can do. So while you can direct pitch ours, we are finding in this kind of just doing enough experimenting that doing a starter puts the yeast in a condition, you know, better and more ready to start fermenting your beer. So there is a lot of other benefits to starters in addition to just increasing your biomass. We're finding that you're essentially getting them kind of ready in a metabolic state to go to town making beer.
I've heard that the Kveik strains actually like to be stressed a little bit and underpitched.
So at least what we've heard, it's all anecdotal.
Yeah.
From our experiments and a lot of, you know, we work with hundreds of brewers that have used this now, commercial brewers who just do regular rates. You know, what we're finding is it's not making any difference.
Yeah.
So, you know, more power to you. We're all about experimenting and go to town, but at least from our experimenting and from just what we hear, it seems to be anecdotal. We still recommend, you know, pitching at regular rates with all the Kveiks.
Could you elaborate on your lager yeast?
Yeah, so the one strain we do offer with homebrew is our Bayern lager, which is from a very famous brewery in Germany. It starts with an A. And we just find it to be the easiest to use and the most tasty. So it's that German slapping the face kind of lager, and it's low in sulfur, low in diacetyl. It's super easy to use, and we love the taste. So we found most people have the best experiences using that. Whether you're making a Pilsner, a lager, a Bock, Oktoberfest, whatever, we found people have the best experience using that.
And are you planning on bringing out a different strain of lager yeast besides that one?
Yeah, so I mean, we offer, so that's the hard part is, so we offer 80-something strains. I think we're like 12 or 15 lagers that we can offer commercial brewers. What's hard in homebrew is, some of those, like Mexican lager, aren't ordered as often. So I think at this point, it's the logistics of trying to figure that out. But, we can talk to Stubby, but say Oktoberfest is coming around and, y'all are able to get together to order like a good, 30 packs amount, then we can, special make that for you and send strains like that down. So it's one of those kind of like strains that aren't ordered as often or a little harder to figure out logistically, but.
So one more question on
Sure.
the lager yeast. If you're gonna do a lager, say around 50 original gravity, you would still it would be best to still make like a 1 liter starter?
At 50 degrees?
No, 50 gravity.
1050.
Oh, 1050, okay. Well, I mean, because to me, it comes down to what temperature you're pitching at, regardless of that.
60 degrees.
At 60, I mean, it couldn't hurt to do a starter. I would go a little warmer if you're not going to do a starter. I guess it comes down to how much do you hate starters or love starters. That's what I found, but at 60, I'd probably still do a starter. At 65, it seems to be you're fine getting away without doing a starter.
I mean, one of the things I like to say about starters, look at it as like when you were a kid, you would get a new goldfish, and you had to put it in the water and to kind of warm it up. You're getting that goldfish acclimated to its new environment. I kind of figure that. I kind of see that's the same what yeast is. You're just kind of getting it ready to go into its new environment. You're getting it ready to rock and roll.
Yeah, again, it can never ever hurt to do a starter. So the only time I think you can really overpitch in a homebrew scale is when you pour on the cake. So if you said made a batch and you have that cake left and pour new fresh wort on that, you're going to overpitch it. And that's really the only time. So you honestly, I don't think you can make a starter almost too big. I'm sure there's somebody who's out here making a 12-liter starter on me, but yeah, if you do one liter starter every time, like it can't hurt. And like I mentioned, like we're finding that you're getting more. It's not necessarily just the cell counts and biomass. Like there's other things at play too. We're getting them in a condition where they're giving them the best chance possible to just tear through your beer and go to town. So.
What did you pitch into the barley wine? Remind me.
What was the size?
We did 2 packs of Hornindal for the barley wine. So again, that could be one where you could have done one pack and a starter 24 hours before on a stir plate. And I don't know if you understand the whole point. Some people have had questions before, like, do I need to use a stir plate? Can't I just come and shake the flask when I walk by it in the kitchen? Well, the whole point of the stir plate is that you're getting oxygen into the solution. So what we recommend, instead of that sponge, I think is just a potential nightmare for contamination, is the biggest reason that things get contaminated is we have bacteria and yeast in the air, and gravity is what's pulling it down. So if you have something open like this cup now, I have a ton of bacteria and yeast that have fallen into my cup while just talking. So that's why if you look in like a microbiological lab, they usually have a hood, and the hood is a reverse air that's sucking air up, so that all that bacteria and yeast is getting sucked upward. Another way people did it old school, or some still do, is you have a Bunsen burner or a flame, and that flame is creating a heat vet upwards, pulling all that yeast and bacteria up and not down into whatever you're doing, whether that's inoculating a plate or pouring or what. So I mean, that's kind of microbiological techniques. So what we found is just putting a piece of foil over your flask. So for instance, if you wanted to do the quickest starter with our proper, you would sanitize the top of the can, sanitize your flask, pop the top, you pour it in, and then use pure water, which generally you do distilled, bottled, boiled, and chilled Generally, if you're in a metropolitan area, you're probably fine. If you're in well water, I would not do it. But we, whatever you deem to be pure water, another can of that to dilute it up to your liter, and then we just recommend, then you pour your yeast, and we recommend just putting a piece of foil over the top of your flask. So that foil allows air to come upward and breathe, so you're getting oxygen into the yeast, but you're not allowing that bacteria or anything else to contaminate it by falling down into it. And the whole point of the stir plate, we're putting a stir bar and allowing it to create that funnel, is not only creating, you're increasing your surface area to volume with that funnel, but you're getting oxygen in the solution, which is most important. So for yeast to really grow and to get as much biomass as possible, I think the experiments we've done is if you don't use a stir plate and use a stir plate, the stir plate will give you 4 or 5 times the biomass than you coming and shaking it or whatever people are doing. So I would highly recommend using a stir plate. It makes a huge difference. You're getting oxygen down in the solution, allowing those yeast to really grow and giving it all you can give it.
Thank you for validating my point. The reason we don't sell those little sponges.
No, they get caked with a bunch of crap, and then before you know it,
get a little angry at us when
Yeah.
we come in and they go, "I want one of those." Oh, we don't care.
Your
The
beer's gonna
best
get-
way to do it is do it.
beer's gonna get herpes. You said no. You don't want that. I've been there. Don't go that way. Does anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
So with the Kveik yeast, it seems like pretty hardy, resilient yeast.
Correct.
In the past, so with the commercial brewery and having to harvest and repitch yeast, we ran into a lot of issues because some of our brands we don't brew regularly. So we harvest into a keg, we throw that in the cooler, and we notice within 24, 48 hours, the viability has gone way, way down. I'm wondering if with the Kveik yeast, if that is a little bit more resistant to that viability decline and autolysis.
It seems to be the same kind of decline. Just it's still, I guess, a yeast strain, but yeah, I mean, we usually recommend. So for us, since we on the commercial side custom prop everything to someone's brew day. So if you're brewing Wednesday, we'll have it shipped and it's there by Tuesday. We recommend using it within 24 hours. Sometimes shit happens and it might be a week, but yeah, you'll see a big drop in viability, including the Norwegian. So it's still, unfortunately, nature. Yeah, there's another question back there. Sorry.
To harvest, what methods, or hold on to it for a while, what methods would you recommend?
I think just the usual. I mean, a lot of people dilute it with, I guess, distilled water just to help, lower the alcohol content. But yeah, we recommend trying not, don't do it for too long. But yeah, if you want to do it, just like you would any other strain. Anybody else? Cool. Well, thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to come down and I'll be around. I gotta try this beer now. Anyway, thank you.